You could build 4 affordable apartments in Colorado for every 1 you built in California.
Who's the biggest culprit?
I think it is, quote, the groups.
Jennifer Hernandez, a seasoned attorney with Holland Knight, specializing in environmental law.
She has tremendous amount of experience with housing in California.
I've never seen a bureaucracy voluntarily get smaller. Why are there no cranes in San Francisco?
We have imbued our resistance to construction with this kind of environmentalist halo.
How do the Democrats in the state of California think they continue to deserve to run the state? Jennifer Hernandez, welcome to State of Gold.
Thank you very
It's
much.
great to see you in person.
Privilege and pleasure as you get this started.
I wonder what it's like for you on an emotional level, observing what's going on in California with working class people most impacted by lack of affordability, least affordable state in the nation, lack of affordable housing at all. What's it like just looking at this situation based on where you've come from?
You know, I kind of cross over emotionally from rage, true rage, because this is for me a complete betrayal of, quote, California values. To have put this kind of pain and suffering on those least able to accommodate and absorb it is outrageous. And those who perpetrate these policy choices are really, from my perspective, way over both the moral and, frankly, legal civil rights line. So rage. Sometimes I get imbued with a sense of optimism, because there's one thing that is true and kind of immutable so far, is we're all going to die. And there is a demographic progression of sort of classic NIMBY, in the name of the environment, Ralph Naderites, who lean pretty far into procedural fetishism. And
Procedural fetishism.
Indeed.
By the way, did you just come up with that, or is this something you've
I have
used?
to.
Procedural fetishism.
It's Nick Bagley, who was chief counsel to.
So you stole that one.
Definitely. And it's also quoted, of course, in Ezra and Derek's book, Abundance. But he was chief counsel to Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, and quickly found that our proceduralism as a legal structure, which was partly meant to protect against government bullies, again, it's kind of 60s, 70s, and then partly also meant to empower community voices, has instead just turned into kind of endless litigation. And there is a frustration with folks in maybe a little less long in tooth than you, but you know, you go through in the 20s, it's neat to live in a kind of expensive luxury dorm and pay a lot in rent. Then you have kids and you realize, oh my God, and then it really hits you. So demographically, there is a frustration with a boomer overhang, both in terms of individual people who stick around quite a long time in my generation, and also with a legal framework that is intended and does a great job at stopping anything from being built in the physical world. And that's a goofy thing that was born when the Beatles were together, and it's kind of time to revisit that. So sometimes I get optimistic. Other times it's just such a stupid fight. We're not arguing about the laws of gravity. We're not arguing about stuff that we can't afford, like building housing or building a new express lane. We're just arguing about ideology, and ideology that has gone far away from the voters and really now lives with what Ezra and others call the groups, you know, the kind of interest groups that have captured my party, the Democratic Party. And it is just so stupid that it occurs to me every 3 or 4 days, we can just fix this with a few strokes of a pen. We don't need to put up with this.
Few strokes of a pen. You know, Newsom temporarily waived CEQA Coastal Act regarding the Southern California rebuild after the horrific fires, right? January fires. Okay, you're smiling. Should executive order in the near term be a solution and a bridge to legislative overhaul of CEQA and the regulatory regime that is choking off building housing? Would you start with flooding the zone with executive orders?
I think obviously those have become highly political as a tactic of the Trump administration, but it is no surprise that our governor had to resort to that tool as well. The reason I initially grimaced is because
Well, you grinned.
CEQA is Hydra headed. And so his initial exemption from CEQA and from the Coastal Act was limited to the rebuild of structures. There's a newsflash: you can actually build something without like sewer lines and electricity. And that exclusion that he crafted did not cover infrastructure. And so it was illusory. It was a performative measure. It sent a strong signal, but it was not legally effective. Now, it could be he just got bad advice and he thought it would be more legally effective. He did also, to his credit, issue a subsequent executive order covering linear infrastructure, but still not roads.
Well, either way, it's sort of he's damned. It's either dumb or misinformed or performative. So you're saying, Jennifer,
damned
that
in three ways.
in
It
three
pissed a
ways.
bunch of people off to do it in the first place, and that showed leadership. And then it was ill-informed or intentionally ineffective, and I don't know which of those is true. And now he's made the next increment for infrastructure, but without picking up road rebuilds, it's still not a real thing. And so if we really do want to expedite rebuilding, it takes taking down the entirety of sort of the CEQA Hydra-headed thing. And even if he covers roads, it doesn't cover public funding decisions. We spent 20 years trying to make temporary homeless shelters exempt from CEQA if they were in an industrial area. And the truth is, there were always that last little bit of government action that wasn't covered. So zoning decisions were exempt. Oh, but not funding decisions. Oh, so that was a CEQA lawsuit. So we have an endless ability with CEQA to tie stuff up in court. Most notorious was the rebuild of a single-family home in Berkeley, unanimously supported by the neighbors, city council, and planning commission, in court for 11 years. So we have to stop the litigation machine that grew up out of the kind of consumer rights
Have to
thing.
stop the litigation machine. I'm sitting here with a legendary land use attorney who ostensibly is part of the machine, right? And you're a unique voice in speaking out about the insanity, but also being in the day-to-day, representing all the different parties, right? That either are victim of CEQA, using CEQA, benefiting from CEQA. It's a crazy situation that you find yourself in and that all the parties find themselves in. Who's the biggest culprit?
So I think it is, quote, the groups. There are special interest groups that have captured what's allowed in the Democratic Party, and they defer to each other. And so I'll give you kind of my political activization, if you will, moment. Initially, it was like 25 years ago or something, when I was doing a lot of work redeveloping former industrial sites, and yet also getting a number of calls from community groups wanting to redevelop the smaller industrial site in their neighborhood for a playground or affordable housing or whatever. And California refused to set standards for how clean you needed to make the site. The rest of the country had done so, but California was procedurally fetishizing the endless process of like reinventing how clean you need to make a gas station to put a Taco Bell on it. I mean, what is that about, right? And what that is about is bureaucratic power, advocate power, and frankly, opportunities to leverage additional unknowable concessions from those seeking government approvals.
Let's talk about those different groups, because I've heard you speak about this. Bureaucracies grow, and they grow with power, with headcount, and with process. And I've never seen a bureaucracy voluntarily get smaller. Just like in the private sector, the businesses I've run, it's very rare to have an executive come back and say, hey, John, I want to give you back a ton of money at the end of the year. And also going into next year in the budget, I want to shrink my budget based on the goals of the business. Who is benefiting Jennifer, from the current regime. Let's just talk about government to start. What does the bureaucracy look like that has grown up to regulate and monitor and study, whether it's at the local or state level, housing and CEQA-related issues?
Well, let's start even higher level for a second. In 2019, the last year of the Jerry Brown administration version 2, we had a lot of state employees, hundreds of thousands already. Between 2019 and last year, we added 58,000
Yes.
more state employees.
State employees.
And so what are these folks doing? And who are they doing it for? And by the way, there's a pretty much, you do your time and you get a 90% pension and a pretty nice, healthcare program.
More than pretty nice.
Yeah. So, we're making, again, these really, really, from my perspective, horrible decisions on behalf of younger people to create these long-term financial burdens that we simply can't afford today, let alone as this next cohort of expanded employees. And what happened during that time? The state became less affordable. Our poverty rate continues to be the worst in the nation, or certainly our education attainment information is an embarrassment, especially given high per pupil spending.
And $120 billion a year on K through 12 education.
Exactly. And so we have, from my perspective, created a whole bunch of people who live in the keyboard economy and talk and write and meet with each other. This is not providing much by way of tangible value to people who need government to work.
Yes.
It's also then not about the physical world. It's hard to even get stuff maintained, let alone built. Mm-hmm. And so to get approvals to get anything built, there's a phalanx of people in multiple agencies now who get to say no or maybe or only if. And there's no grown-up saying, the answer has to be yes, and we can't make it unaffordable, and we can't insist on something that people don't want or can't afford. I mean, what are you thinking? There's no one exercising that adult leadership.
It sounds like there should be a housing czar empowered in California to cut through all of the process and red tape. But let's come back. We're going to come back to solutions in a minute. There's also an extortion racket going on in California where there are educated interests and groups that know how to make money leveraging CEQA when someone wants to build something. How does the extortion racket work?
Sure. So I, as a lawyer, I come at this question from the back forward. If you knew what you needed to do to comply with CEQA, you would simply do it. And if you got sued, so what? Because you did what you needed to do. But we don't know what you need to do. CEQA is very much like obscenity. We know it when we see it in terms of what's good enough. It has an extraordinary high loss rate in court for public agencies. Normally, if you sue a public agency, your odds are not good. Think about suing the IRS. How many of those lawsuits are you going to really win? Not too many. And that's by design. We don't want people to sue the IRS. We want people to pay their taxes. So we make the requirements clear. That's a rule of law. You can't have a rule of law if you don't know what the law requires. And what CEQA has always been, remember CEQA 1970, Beatles were together, Nixon, Reagan, it was like a different time. We didn't have the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Coastal Act. We didn't have modern environmental law. It was only CEQA and the national analog, NIMBY. And in that world, judges and advocates on both sides, as well as agencies, had to invent stuff. And in that invention world, when this law was first emerging, it was kind of case by case, right? Is this enough? Is this too much? Maybe this should be different. That ethic in litigation continues, which means, as a couple really noted experts on the CEQA preservationist side have noted, it is entirely unpredictable to predict, to kind of think about what are the odds in court. Because of that unpredictability, the threat of a CEQA lawsuit has a lot of power. is it going to be successful, this lawsuit? And then it couples with a further consequence of CEQA, which is the most common judicial remedy, is to rescind all project approvals and start with what I'm telling you to start with, the judge says, but then there's no boundaries about what else can you be sued.
So the judges are the housing czars in California, it sounds like. There's a tyranny of the law against building. You know, one thing that strikes me, Jennifer, is we're in your beautiful office in downtown San Francisco. Someone's still paying big time rent in downtown San Francisco, regardless of how, you know, the occupancy of these commercial buildings. We can look out at San Francisco, there are no cranes.
Yeah.
There are no cranes. I spent a lot of time traveling the country in real estate, and you go to certain cities and there are cranes, and they happen to be in the Sun Belt. What is it about California, San Francisco, other major cities, such that there are no cranes being built? If you had to dissect the anatomy of the couple big reasons there are no cranes right now, you've laid out a few of the reasons, but I know there are others. There are fees and there are other issues. Why are there no cranes in San Francisco?
I think a major reason for this, but dating back really to the late 70s and a really terrific book by an MIT professor called The Environmental Protection Hustle, we have imbued our resistance to construction with this kind of environmentalist halo, and that feels good. Whereas if we were honest and said, yeah, no, we just don't want new people. We don't. We really don't. It's hard to find parking. We don't want new people. There's a fundamental anti-growth, frankly, depopulate. Remember, there were folks calling for, like, who let Silicon Valley be Silicon Valley? We didn't vote for that. They should take their jobs and go. They're winning, right? That ethic of I've got mine, get out of here, is always present at some level in pretty places. But here we get to say what's now is the environment that needs protecting. Whatever the status quo is what our bias is to protecting. And that's why people who, you know, demand all kinds of stuff, whether it's 5 layers of architecture for each window, which is kind of cool looking, but when you look at the cost, you're kind of wondering, is that really worth it?
Is that the whole tight building philosophy?
Tight building,
keep all the air inside, so that it's better
that's one of the all-time
for the
favorite.
humans in the building, and drive up the costs of air
everything.
purification and systems and maintenance. That's what you're talking about.
Also that, but sometimes it's pure aesthetics. It's just like we want it to look really pretty. But yeah, the idea that in one of the most temperate climates on Earth, we're
Don't
going
open the window.
Treat these buildings as though it's the Starship Enterprise and have to filter and never open a window is definitely.
I want to come back to this cruel irony of how environmentalism, well, listen, environmentalists are an important group. We all should be environmentalists. But that moniker and that movement has been twisted and perverted to become a fig leaf or a show, performative, to block rational and reasonable development that benefits most the working class people who want to live near where they work, right? Which is the cruel irony. They can't live near where they work. They can't live near the coasts, and they can't live near the downtowns. You've called these policies racist, hurting minority groups, and anti-union. It's the cruelest irony, isn't it?
It's a horror. And frankly, it's a horror that has, I think, emerged as a leadership class among the groups, has frankly strayed further and further away from the interests of the group's members. We did a study not too long ago where a solid union construction job, which is pretty good wages, 120, 140K a year,
Can't afford to live in any county median income or median home price touching the bay, or in Southern California touching the ocean. Unbelievable.
Any county.
Unbelievable.
And so that is a betrayal. So I go to the rage place, right? That is a betrayal of the people who you are supposed to be protecting. And there's multiple causes for it, but I no longer am tolerant of multiple causes. It's like you guys went so far that you have hurt so many people that you should now be ashamed.
You know, we talked about this a few minutes ago. I grew up in Boston. Anyone who grows up in Boston is pretty much a Democrat when you're born. It's changed a bit. There have been Republican governors, but it's really a Democratic state, and known as a Democratic state. But, you know, I feel like many that the Democratic Party left me, and I'm no longer a Democrat. You've been a staunch Democrat for a long, long time. You're holding on, white knuckling, being a Democrat. How do the Democrats in the state of California think they continue to deserve to run the state? Whether it's constitutional officers or the boards, the air resources boards, where you have a crazy, interesting story of being a truth teller and then being vindicated, right? How do Democrats justify staying in charge? And how do you stay with the party?
I stay with the party, I'll start with that, because for my lifetime, especially from my roots, it has been the party of the working class. You know, when my grandfather keeled over when he was in his 50s, and Mexican immigrant, it was a union policy that paid off the mortgage and allowed my grandmother to live in dignity. That's a powerful element to what it once was. But the rhetoric and the hypocrisy of the current policy is, from my perspective, most completely hidden behind two slogans. One is climate. We have this higher duty to Earth. Unless we make sure you can't replace your hot water heater with a $15,000 gizmo that may or may not heat the water well enough, Earth and civilization will end. And that kind of apocalyptic doomerism both masks the legitimate need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and, frankly, diversify for lots of reasons our energy supply. We need to do that, but not at the cost of keeping people from having hot water, which then, by the way, means you don't have a habitable unit, which means then you have to get evicted, which means then we have even less housing. So climate doomerism is one mask. The other mask, frankly, is this notion of equality of outcome and how capitalism and democracy are not aligned with justice, and that's even more perverse and more challenging. But the truth is, we have some hardcore city hotspots of Democratic Socialists of America, and we have a party that is much more progressive than old school liberal Democrat, and the numbers are not looking good.
Well, in today's world, Jennifer, you might be considered a conservative.
Indeed.
So it is a cruel irony. I think that I can tell you're internally struggling with it. I want to take a quick time out to tell our audience, if you're enjoying this show, please follow us and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss an episode with an amazing guest like Jennifer. And Jennifer, I want to shift to talk about solutions for a minute, because we can grouse and we can bitch, but the question is, how do we change this regime for the better and the state for the better? And I want to play God for a sec. You and I have the power to clean the slate, to clean the legal and regulatory slate. And we're now dealing with a pristine legal and regulatory environment. We've gone back to the 70s in California. If you had to write the newspaper headline for the framework that you'd want to see in place that protects the environment, which we all want to do, especially in California, it's the ethos of California, but provides for growth and the construction of housing, particularly affordable housing, how would you propose the framework?
So in a headline format, I think it's something like, if you comply with the law, you can build. And what I mean by that is complying with objective standards that everyone can look up and say, aha, the wires have to be this thick in this wall. We're not debating that issue, and we don't debate wires and thickness anymore. We should have that for pretty much everything now, because we do have the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and all of the environmental laws that make sure you don't put a metal smelter next to a preschool or allow anyone to spew a bunch of noxious pollutants. I think environmental law has had just a tremendous track record when properly implemented in improving air quality, to pick an example. Obama in 2016 announced that tailpipe emissions from our nation's vehicle fleet, passenger fleet, were 99% cleaner than 1972 fleet. Isn't that remarkable? That's how come we can breathe and I'm not still smelling the air as I did when I grew up. The ability to manage environmental standards along with workplace and worker protection standards and public health standards and everything else, we now have a whole bunch of laws and regs that say what you can do.
We have lots of laws and regs.
But no mas to the lawyers. We never allowed, even in the height of this kind of procedural fetishism, people to sue to block a third grader from enrolling in a public school. There are just things we recognize are of right. We really need to return law enforcement duties to law enforcers,
Officials.
to prosecutors, to attorneys general, and end the notion that anybody could sue for any reason, regardless of what their purported environmental
Can I do a
claim is.
trial summary of what you just said? Because I know there are other pieces, but the key aspect of what you said, which is classic, because often Democrats will say, if we just had another law,
Right.
if we just had another law, another procedure, things would be okay. What I heard you say is we have all of the laws on the books that we need. That regime's been built up over decades in California since the 70s. And it probably covers most of the nooks and crannies. What you're saying is if people who want to build are complying with the laws on the books, they should be able to do it. I heard that, number one. Amen to that. And number two is we need to restrict enforcement or prosecution of malfeasance on the laws on the books to law enforcement officials as opposed to anyone.
Right.
So it's those two things.
That's right.
Is there anything else?
Yeah, so this one's a little harder because we have created policies that we can't afford. So the RAND Corporation just did a really good study, multifamily housing development in Colorado, Texas, and California, and among other things concluded you could build 4 affordable apartments in Colorado for every 1 you built in California. And that is an accretion of standards. And the accretion of standards in siloed agencies that simply each want to do their thing has resulted in an overload of unaffordable mandates.
State or local agencies?
Both. So LA County had a proposed climate action plan that would restrict imported water to 10% of that region's water supply. They didn't apparently watch Chinatown or something, I don't know. But the truth is, and people were talking about cisterns in like multi-year or multi-month, climate conditions don't actually work. And so we do need a stomp it down. And really, I think a rollback. And personally, I think a rollback to about 2020 would capture, 2010 would capture most of what we can't afford. And that's awkward, but the RAND study said one of the many causes that California has such high costs, apart from fees and everything else, and there are other ideas about that, is we have all these environmental standards in buildings that are really expensive, and they may be good for the environment, but at what cost and at what increment of environmental improvement? And there just isn't a grown-up that is making those adjustments. And so we do have to roll back.
And these are both state and local, as you mentioned. And the irony here is very thick and very cruel. we build in places that are fire prone. We rebuild in places that are fire prone. By the way, someone who's lost their home, I do not blame them for a second for wanting to rebuild and stay in their community. I understand that financial and emotional, reality. But we build in places that are fire prone. We don't do forest management properly. We burn huge tracts of housing, and all of those chemicals and all of that stuff goes into the air and cancels out how many years or decades of climate action. And then we continue to overregulate, and then we can't build more housing. And who loses? Regular people, working class people,
Yeah.
all the people that you've talked about from towns like Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Is there?
But let me challenge a little bit of that narrative.
Please.
All of California is fire prone. We have extended months without rain. It's one of the reasons people like the climate. Some of the biggest conflagrations, and the easiest one to remember is just the normal suburb in Santa Rosa that went like that. And that's a problem, just like things falling down in an earthquake is a problem. But then we actually learned from that problem, and now we have fire-safe standards for new construction. One of the most effective things we could do is build fire-safe communities from scratch, because to retrofit everything into fire-safe is unaffordable for even relatively wealthy people. But we have examples of structures that'll burn in 45 minutes, and then the identical looking structure with the right material that won't burn at all. So we should never underestimate our ability to cope with earthquakes or fire risks. We should be pretty critical of the idea that regional open space agencies, for whom a blade of grass is too precious to trim at the edge of someone's fence, and say, yeah, that's right, too precious, and allow them to do veg management that is an unbelievable hazard for the people living at the edge. And so we also have to recognize that responsibility goes in both directions, including to the open space management agencies. And they don't want to do it. For them, their mission is to preserve and protect the natural environment as that has come to be in 2025, which is not the natural environment of 1875. It is something we've created. Sorry, but we did. So it's a conflagration of factors. But to sort of say, climate catastrophe and fire-prone areas, no, we're all fire-prone. The Berkeley Hills went up in flames. It's a risk in Chicago, for God's sake, but you can manage and make safe, and we don't have to be in despair about it. But it's also not a question of like redlining hoity-toity neighborhoods. The fire lines in the Bay Area in particular are wealth lines. The wealthier the neighborhood, the higher the fire risk. So let's not put new people there. Doesn't that line up conveniently with a NIMBY environmentalist agenda?
You're advising the next governor, and there's obviously a huge interest in making change in this area strategically. There's multifaceted challenge here with getting housing going in the state. Newspaper headlines, so keep it succinct. But what are the top strategies you're recommending for the next governor and the governor's team to change the game on housing in California?
So starting in 2017, we've now had more than 200 new housing laws to promote housing. Housing production fell 58% in LA. So
no more laws, thank you.
Using the Sicilian part of my family, basta. I think executive order authority suspending this proceduralism, not suspending environmental protection standards, but the proceduralism and litigation that we've put in place, that to me is the easy example, and that will produce actual construction, not just of housing, but of the infrastructure and public services.
And why hasn't Newsom done that?
The groups.
The interest groups.
The groups.
That have the dinero.
Have the dinero and love having that leverage power. And frankly, love being able to sue and hope to stop it entirely in their neighborhood. Why not? Mm-hmm. So many of these lawsuits are brought by wealthier folks to block apartments. I mean, these are class distinctions.
Probably
as well.
Democrats.
Oh yeah.
Let's do some rapid fire to finish this
All right.
conversation. Awesome conversation. I want to ask you a few questions and give me kind of your gut or sort of phrase answers. You're queen for a day. The single biggest thing you do to make California better?
I would actually abolish CARB, the Air Resources Board.
Abolish the Air Resources Board. I love it. I can feel people. I can feel the tension among among your friends in California. Which California leader, past or present, do you admire and why?
Pat Brown was kind of the governor who produced our core infrastructure,
Yes.
including our social and political capital infrastructure in the UC system. I don't know that there's another governor before or since who's captured quite as much advancement on both the physical building side and the amplification benefits of the physical construction that was undertaken.
Mm-hmm. Old school. What do outsiders get wrong about California?
I think they assume we know what we're doing on climate, which is a horror, is what we're doing, is just making it ever more expensive for working people to negligible or even adverse consequences on greenhouse gas emission levels. I mean, shutting down industrial jobs in California so we can import more from China kills how many different tactics, but the original sin in the climate movement is to look at a geographic area and say, we got to reduce impact.
Degrowth.
It's not just degrowth, it's reduce the emissions in a geographic area.
Fewer people,
fewer
companies.
Even if we're consuming the same products that are produced elsewhere, and the result is more global greenhouse gas emissions. You grow the tomatoes in Fresno, but God forbid we make ketchup because that's natural gas. Oh my God. So we'll ship the tomatoes to Reno, make ketchup, and send it back and call it a win, right? That's just, and then by the way, all those jobs lost, all those revenues lost. I mean, it's just a totally fraudulent metric. So assuming California, next is assuming California actually is aligned with working people. It's not. It hasn't been for years. And then third is assuming that, in some way or another, California is a rich and prosperous state. It is at, say, a GDP level where our biggest contributors are the information technology sector, which is fabulous and largely unregulated. And if people did have to vote, you wouldn't have survived a vote to create Silicon Valley as it's emerged. It would have been voted down. Real estate values, great. And then government employment. That's our three biggest GDP
but we
contributors.
have upwards of a third of Californians who are really struggling and in poverty.
Yeah, and a million without safe drinking water.
It's a terrible statistic. Last question. It's a one-word answer. California is
unbelievably cool.
Unbelievable. Two words, but I think very apt.
Yeah. It's home too.
It's home.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you,
Great
John.
Conversation.
Thank you very much. I really
love
appreciate
your style, and you're kind of holding this unique space. And I hope you've got lots of buddies with you in the cafeteria, sitting with you, loving you and debating you all at the same time. But thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.